Russia's war on Ukraine has changed everything. As men fight on the front lines, millions of women are fighting another war, one for survival, dignity, and purpose. In the freezing mines beneath Donbas, in the driver's seats of supply trucks, and in the shattered fields once known as Europe's breadbasket, they're rebuilding what the bombs destroyed. But this is not just a Ukrainian story. It's about the price of resilience, the limits of sacrifice, and a world learning too late that peace was never guaranteed. In the first part, we meet the women who kept Ukraine's heart beating under fire. In the second, we see how technology and weapons, from Western missiles to digital warfare, reshaped the battlefield. And in the third, we uncover the consequences spreading across Europe, where armies weaken and nations wonder, who will defend us next? This is the new face of war, where strength is measured not by armies, but by endurance.
Russia's war on Ukraine is pushing the country to breaking point. Most frontline fighters are men, leaving many women to fight another battle.
Начебто в тебе є чоловік, але по факту його немає.
Людей нема, ні хлопців, ні нікого. Ти забуваєшся про все і працюєш.
This work has brought adversity and opportunities they could not have imagined.
Я была очень рада. Мы были первые девочки в шахте.
У нас є на це фізичні, моральні сили не гірші чоловіків.
This is the story of 3 women among millions. Their lives are the untold story of this war.
Держу худобу, 6 корів держу, 4 бичка, свині. Городів всього в мене 22 города. Осталась сама. Андрій безвісті пропавший, з яким держали хазяйство. Чоловік служить уже 2 года і 3 місяці. Коли хлопців забрали, дуже тяжко було і вирішила, що я покину. А потім все-таки я давала обіцянку, що я буду держати і ждати, поки ви поприходите. Все, навчилася самотьоком їздити на тракторі, вивчилася на права. Це завжди в мене робота знаходиться.
Since the war began, millions, mainly women and children, fled the country, while it was mainly men who joined the army. In total, Ukraine has lost around 27% of its pre-war workforce.
Та тут проблема зараз в селі. Людей, молодіжі немає, молодіж виїхала за границю. Працювати самі жінки дуже тяжко. Коли не виходить чоловік на зв'язок і не знаєш, де вони і що, депресія тоді. Ти забуваєшся про все і працюєш до упаду. Це просто все зараз держу на плаву, що жду, що хлопці повертаються. Надіжда вся, що все буде добре. Вмирає остання надіжда, що
While the conflict has forced some women into work, for others, the war has created unusual opportunities.
Мой папа был шахтером, поэтому еще в юном возрасте своем у меня был первый спуск в шахту. Вот тогда, наверное, я влюбилась, и мне захотелось именно работать.
Татьяна у нас вообще, она очень уникальный человек. Она была одна из первых, кто согласилась пойти в шахту. У нас стал критический вопрос в связи с тем, что наши ребята пошли защищать родину, нехватка кадров. 48 человек в результате исполнения своих обязанностей, к сожалению, погибли. Наши женщины, которые работали в то время на предприятии, на поверхности, выступили с инициативой использовать женский труд в шахте. До войны женщины в шахте не работали у нас.
When war broke out in 2022, an emergency law was passed, allowing women like Tatiana to work underground in so-called heavy, harmful and dangerous jobs.
Я была очень рада, была в числе первых. Я до сих пор чувствую себя особенно. Дедушка работал в добыче. Он, кстати, был по профессии тоже машинист подземной установки, как и я. Я управляю лебедкой, которая опускает материалы, опускает людей по уклонам в шахте.
Men and women are paid the same for doing this underground work. So Tatiana is now earning twice as much as she did for her old job above ground.
Когда пришли учениками, конечно, над нами вообще тряслись. У нас же мужчины были наставниками. То есть они нас боялись куда-то отпустить, все время будь рядом, никуда не ходи.
Ми завжди допомагали дівчатам. Перші дні вони ж прийшли, нічого не знали, нічого не бачили. Просимо, щоб не робили важкого, не піднімали їм. Стараємося їм допомагати все время, тому що вони жінки, їм потрібно допомагати. Та зараз таке время у нас важке в країні, то жінки нам трохи допомагають. Так потрібно, нам потрібно це.
The economy is not only struggling because men are at the front. There is a shortage of drivers who can take trucks in and out of the country. So for the first time, women are being trained to drive heavy goods vehicles to help transport critical supplies from Europe.
Як би ви себе описали?
Українська жінка. Сильно. Мабуть, нас війна зробила більш сильнішими.
Women were banned from driving trucks until 2017, along with 450 so-called dangerous jobs, under a Soviet-era law to protect their fertility.
І дізналася про цю можливість отримати категорію С і водити великі вантажівки, про що не можна було і мріяти, тому що це якось казали щось заоблачне.
А які у вас відчуття, коли ви за кермом такої машини?
Шалені. Жінки хочуть, вони хочуть водити вантажівки. У нас є на це фізичні, моральні сили, не гірші чоловіків. Саме перша мрія – це зробити якийсь такий далекобійний рейс через Європу. Просто на велич 40 тонн, 60, проїхати Європу. Одним рейсом хоча б просто, це, мабуть, така мрія.
А от хотів узнати, чим ти тут займаєшся, поки мене немає.
Фури кажу.
Каже, фури возять. Я цілком позитивно ставлюсь до будь-якого розвитку особистості. Будь-якого. Єдине, що мене трохи бентежить, це те, що так як я людина військова, то з ким буде дитина. Тому що я от сьогодні зараз з вами розмовляю, а мов через годину вже десь там відбивати напад, так сказати. Це єдиний такий момент, який мене трохи бентежить. Поки я спокійний. Що воно буде далі, хто його знає.
Андрію, хоч їсти.
Гості не будуть.
Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. But farming has suffered $10 billion of losses since the conflict started in 2022.
Вже не буде кукурузи солодкої, не буду садити. Косіння менше буде заготівлі вже. Здала трохи худобу і менше буде сінажу.
То ви зменшуєте зараз собі поступово об'єм, бо стає слабо.
Так, так. Два роки самі – це дуже тяжко. Цілий день то в хаті, то коло в сараї. Все по-старому. Так, як і було, тільки що менше роботи.
Часто си звънвате с чоловіком? Разсуди.
Тяжко їм уже там потомилися всі, вони вже хочеться, щоб кінчилася війна, щоб вже всі були вдома, щоб не бути самому вже. Майже, може, хватить ще на рік мене, щоб працювати. Як дали обіцянку, треба її виконувати.
Сину не вистачає тата через службу. Постійно на сутках, а хлопчик росте, йому треба тата. Футбол поганяти, на велику навчити. Він зараз добре вже почав розмовляти. Ой, мені це дійсно дуже боляче, коли дитина каже слово «ракета». Це останнє, яке я хотіла, щоб він знав слово. А так інших. Я по-іншому не знаю, як виховувати. Ми народились під час війни, він зростає під час війни. Сподіваюся, що він виросте і цього пам'ятати не буде.
It is now 5 months since Zhenya qualified as a truck driver.
Чому ви дотепер не маєте роботи водієм фури?
Тому що, по-перше, нема з ким дитину залишити. Навіть якщо якісь регіональні рейси по Київській області, все одно в садочок треба комусь відвезти, з садочка треба комусь забрати. А хто захоче взяти на роботу, припустимо, з 9 до 4 години? Ніхто не захоче.
To allow her to look after her son, Zhenya has taken a job closer to home.
Дуже люблю водити. Моє б діло по це кожен день би кудись їздила. Я сьогодні вранішню доставку зробила.
Що везли?
Композицію квітів. Допомагаю в доставці квітів, розвозці, закупці. Розвиваємо інші мережі, шукаємо нових клієнтів. І для того, щоб надалі розвиватися, нам треба буде оптові закупівлі напряму від постачальника. Постачальники і виробники знаходяться у нас в основному Європа. Для того буде придбана велика автівка.
Тобто ви плануєте все-таки їздити? Ви не відмовляєте?
Ні в коїм разі не йду. Просто ми йдемо кроками поступово до своєї мети.
It is not yet clear what the future holds for the women of Ukraine. But as hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or wounded during the conflict, there's likely to be continued need for women's labor to help rebuild the country.
Трусились над нами, конечно, да. Ну, а уже потом привыкли. И сейчас все отлично, мы работаем все вместе, у нас большой дружный коллектив. Я считаю, что это хорошо, что женщинам дали возможность показать, проявить себя. Очень жаль, что именно из-за того, что началась война, вот, как бы мы пришли к этому.
Я вже навчилася, що всьому свій час, що воно, цей досвід з фурами, з цим, багато за ті 3 тижні надав такої впевненості. Трапиться туди, коли треба.
Які у вас мрії на майбутнє?
Нема ніякої мрії, поки що. Не те время. Нічого не хочеться. Хочеться, щоб повернулися хлопці додому. Потім будуть мрії.
Ukrainian troops are mounting a stiffer than expected resistance to Russian forces. And that is thanks in no small part to the flood of weapons provided by Western countries, in particular, the Javelin missile. NATO countries, including the US, have sent thousands of anti-tank missiles, including the Javelin missiles, to Ukraine. So to help us understand how this technology works and why it's proving so effective, we're joined now by Bloomberg senior reporter for international affairs, Mark Champion. Mark, thanks as always for being here. Tell us more about the Javelin missile, because it's the newest, most modern incarnation of anti-tank missiles. Can you explain how it works and why it's so effective?
Well, briefly, it's a so-called third generation of anti-tank weapon. And what makes it different is that essentially it will go over a tank, it will fly up, and then it will come down onto the roof of the tank where there's less armor. So it's able to puncture a tank, and in a way that other weapons that hit the sides where there's more armor hanging off, there's explosive armor that sort of pushes missiles away, it isn't a protection there. So that's one part of it. The other is that it's a so-called fire and forget missile. So essentially the person using it just shoots it and it can immediately get away. Because as soon as you fire an anti-tank missile or any missile of that sort, you give your position away and the other side can just fire straight back. So this allows you, with older weapons, you more or less, the so-called wire-guided weapons, you have to stand there and wait until it actually hits.
I see. So the missiles rain down upon the tank at its most vulnerable area, which is on top. What does the increased usage of Javelin missiles and these anti-tank missiles signal about the war?
Well, they won't win you a war. I'm not a military expert, but I have spoken to people who think about this stuff all the time, and what they say is they won't win you a war, but there are a lot of them in Ukraine now, an extraordinary density, so that there's every time that the Russians make a maneuver with their tanks or their convoys, then they have to worry that whoever meets them is going to have some of these and would be able to destroy them. So it really does change the calculations of the other side. And you've seen a couple of, several videos where the Russians have tried to break into Kiev with quite large, convoys of tanks and APCs and, anti-aircraft, mobile anti-aircraft. There's a whole unit that was trying to break into the city and then was ambushed. And, they had to retreat. All kind of 20, 30 or more vehicles had to suddenly get into reverse and retreat. And they lost several. And that really means that the Russians have to think differently about how they're going to take a city.
Right. No, I think that's a really important point to make, which is as effective as these missiles are, they don't change the fact that Russia is in attack mode and Ukraine is defending itself. And so while the weaponry makes it harder for Russia to achieve its goal, it'll probably drag out the fighting. The fact remains that Russia's goal is still within reach. And in this case, it is to take the capital. What's been the damage so far? What can you tell us about the damage?
The damage to the vehicles.
Russian forces, yeah.
Right. Well, the numbers are always incredibly difficult in wartime, especially casualties and losses, because each side basically reduces their own and increases the opposition's. But we do now have what they call open source intelligence, basically people who spend a lot of time on social media just looking for images and then geolocating and verifying basically that these are real, and making sure you don't double count. So roughly the Russians have lost about 215 or so tanks now. Around, a little under 80 of those were destroyed or damaged, and then the rest either captured or abandoned.
Okay, and we actually showed a graphic earlier as well, since we're on numbers, where the UK sent about 3,600 of these next generation missiles, anti-tank missiles. Germany has sent about 1,000, Norway 2,000, Sweden 5,000, and the US has sent some over, but we don't know how many. How do Russian forces adapt to the use of these weapons? Because it changes the contour of the battle. And I know you're not a military expert, but there is history that we can draw upon here, right? Because Israel, for instance, confronted the use of anti-tank missiles against it in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah, that's right. So they had just fought the 1967 war and had been very successful, not faced a lot of resistance to their tanks. And then in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Egyptians had in the meantime bought what then was the latest technology in anti-tank weapons from the Soviet Union. And those were wire guided. And suddenly the Israelis were taking significant losses. So they now had to rethink how they would fight. And essentially, what it boils down to is that whereas before you would move the tanks forward and your infantry behind, to protect them, you then had to put your infantry out front to protect the tanks, just to clear away any of these anti-tank missiles that are going to be there. And that's basically what the Russians will have to do going into the cities. And in order to go in, you then need to prepare the ground, and that's where it gets really ugly, because it means more artillery shelling, more preparation of the ground, so that the defenders are in shock or in hiding, and then the worst comes when you need to get to if they decide that they need to remove the defense even when they're underground, because then you use different kinds of weapons which are truly brutal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you're describing sounds like a really long, drawn-out urban warfare, which is damaging to both sides.
I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
Britain is back on a war footing, but apparently in threadbare shoes.
The combat power that the British Army can bring to bear is much, much less than it has been able to.
It's now its smallest size since the Napoleonic era, losing more people than it's recruiting.
Reversing course would require a level of sustained investment that eclipses the timeline of the current Prime Minister's administration. Meanwhile, the deadliest conflict in Europe since 1945 is already here. The threat of Russian aggression is perceived to be only increasing, and patience between NATO members is wearing thin.
Our allies have taken advantage of us more so than our enemies. I said, if you're not going to pay your bills, we're not going to defend you.
The issue is that while the threat is immediate, the fiscal cupboard is bare, and there's no time for saving.
And that's going to require some very difficult trade-offs for the government.
Voters say that they want more security and they're in favour of greater defence spending. They don't necessarily want to pay for it.
So now one of the most critical jobs for the UK government is to find a solution, and quickly. Problem is, nobody knows if one even exists. Security experts now believe Britain is incapable of defending itself against a ballistic missile attack. That may come as a surprise.
There is this significant gap between Britain's rhetoric and reputation and its actual military capabilities.
The reputation of the UK Armed Forces has historically been very high. However, that reputation has been steadily declining over probably the last 2 decades. In Iraq, especially in 2009, the US had to come south and actually support the Iraqi forces and effectively bail out UK troops. And the same happened in Afghanistan.
So what went wrong?
There are a number of shortfalls within the UK military, both in the maritime and land domains. One of the significant issues at the moment is personnel numbers.
The Labour government did, when it last left office in 2010, leave the army with around 100,000 personnel.
But that was already a decline, and a government strategic defence and security review in 2010 and 2011 concluded further cuts were warranted. Personnel numbers plummeted.
The current target strength is 72,500, but if you actually take it on available strength, it's around 55,000. But actually retention is the most important because you're losing trained personnel, potentially with operational experience. Poor housing stock makes soldiers leave early, and that is a key risk for the government.
Troop shortages are just the start. A key point of the government's latest Strategic Defence Review, published in June, set out plans for Britain to return to warfighting competitiveness. That includes addressing low ammunition reserves and sluggish, outdated procurement cycles.
The UK has very high-end equipment in terms of anti-submarine warfare capabilities, long-range strike capabilities as examples. The issue is there's just not enough of them. If you don't have enough of these systems, you can't effectively train on them.
Dwindling numbers of troops, tanks and training are the result of underinvestment by successive Conservative governments. But Britain is a member of the G7 and one of the richest countries in the world. So where did all the money go?
Since 1955, there's been a correlation between the UK's ballooning health and welfare bill and cuts to defence spending.
And some economists have called that the peace dividend, where reductions in the amount spent on defence has been recycled into other areas. Possibly lower taxes, possibly higher spending on other areas, one of which is health.
That's what you're seeing here. As a share of GDP over the last 7 decades, the UK's military expenditure has decreased, while spending on healthcare has gone the other direction. This is that so-called peace dividend in action.
In the 50s, you had defence spending at 7.5% of GDP and health spending at around 3% of GDP. You can almost flip those numbers around now.
Those percentages now pose as much of a problem for Britain as they do a priority for NATO. And for the superpower that accounts for 2/3 of the alliance's defence spending. The North Atlantic Treaty Organisation was assembled in 1949 to protect Western Europe during the Cold War. Member nations pledged to uphold a collective defence, meaning an attack on one is essentially an attack on all, and thus a greater risk to potential aggressors. 12 initial members grew to 32 today, each agreeing to defence expenditure equal to a percentage of GDP.
The last NATO Defence Industrial Pledge was agreed at the Wales Summit in 2014, which was to spend 2% by 2024, which just over 2/3 of allies do now.
Some contribute more.
Poland spends 4%, a little over 4% of GDP, and the US as well spends 3.4% of GDP on defence.
Like Britain, nearly all countries spend less than they once did, as Cold War brinkmanship gave way to burger chains across former Soviet heartlands. But that's all changed now.
The world is just a far more dangerous place.
And it's now widely accepted that no one pays enough for defence, and that NATO relies overwhelmingly on the US for leadership, coordination, muscle and money.
2% is a start, as President Trump has said, but it's not enough. More like 5%.
This kind of rhetoric has only grown louder since Donald Trump returned to the White House.
It's not a coincidence that the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that he would ramp up defence spending in the UK just weeks after US President Donald Trump entered office.
All that in May, he signed a defence pact between the EU and the UK. But, as we've seen, Britain has decades of making up to do, munition stockpiles to replenish, soldiers and reservists to recruit, and we haven't even mentioned things like these, nuclear submarines or AI-guided drones and cyber defence. So what's the plan? In June, UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves committed to greater spending on defence.
Defence spending will now rise to 2.6% of GDP by April 2027, including the contribution of our intelligence agencies.
The government announced that it would be paid for by a reduction in spending on foreign aid.
Now we're seeing NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte in fact commit to upping the NATO target to 5%.
And here lies Britain's central dilemma.
By 2030, it would mean an extra £87 billion worth of spending on defence.
That's an additional annual spend roughly equal to the UK's education budget, or a little under half what's currently spent on health and social care. Bloomberg Economics estimated that raising defence spending to 5% of GDP will add £350 billion to the level of government debt by 2032. But the administration's hands are tied.
It has said in its manifesto that it doesn't want to raise income tax, it doesn't want to raise VAT, it doesn't want to raise corporation tax or employee national insurance contributions. Those taxes account for the vast majority of tax revenue in the UK.
So that's out then. The other option is borrowing, but servicing Britain's existing debt, that is to say, just paying the interest, costs £100 billion a year. A decision to hike that would be taken against a backdrop of elevated interest rates and start a figurative war with the bond market.
It's very hard to believe the government would be able to get away with raising borrowing by that amount.
Add to this, polling suggests defence spending is low on the British public's priority list compared to healthcare, immigration, or the economy. With that in mind, the other option, if it can be called such a thing, is to rely on high levels of defence spending in an attempt to boost long-term economic growth.
What gives the best chance of success? Well, it would be focusing expenditure on investments, and investments in this country. It would be no good importing aircraft or aircraft carrier from the US. That wouldn't provide a domestic boost to the economy. And the other area where the evidence suggests that economies stand to benefit is where military spending is focused on research and development.
That could lift UK productivity, meaning employers create more value for the same amount of work, for instance producing autonomous drones rather than basic munitions or small arms.
Research and development takes up a very small share of the UK defence budget, so there would need to be a big ramp up in research and development spending to yield a big impact on the economy.
More orders with defence contractors leads to jobs, more money spent by workers, and thus more tax receipts for the government. The problem is that spinning up capacity takes time, and crucially, commitment.
I went, for example, to see a factory making munitions in the north of England for BAE Systems, which is a major defence contractor for the MOD. They are bringing on more capacity, but that's because of prior agreements. They want more commitments now.
Industry will open a new line of production for artillery shells if they think that they're going to get 20 years of orders. If they think they're only going to get 3 years of orders, well, they might not do so.
They need to be sure what the demand is, so they need those contracts from the UK government or from allied governments to know exactly what they need to make, and that's the kind of certainty that they've been looking for a while.
Britain's defence strategy is now trapped by a fundamental paradox. A system designed for short-term survival is being asked to make long-term rearmament commitments. Everyone agrees Britain needs to prepare. Nobody knows whether it can afford to.